Hi, everybody. Please be very welcome today to snowy Stockholm. Well, this is not very normal in the middle of April, but what is normal these days? And hopefully spring will return, but what will actually return and what will change after the pandemics? This is the topic for today's discussion. I am Tobias Nielsén, founder of and publisher at Volante, and we are publishing this great book, and we are hosting this event in collaboration with our speakers agency, Speakers.net. With us today, we have the authors, Kjell Nordström and Per Schlingmann. Kjell, an advisor to global enterprises and a well-known speaker and economist. He has a background as a researcher at Stockholm School of Economics. And Per, we know him as a leading political strategist in Sweden, but currently I would say is mostly an entrepreneur and an author. So welcome here, Per and Kjell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if we can have you up here as well. So how are you today?
Actually great. After a year that compares to nothing, of course, but here I am in a great shape.
Yes, it's very good. And we actually started the morning a little bit with talking about the book for a company. So we are in the mood actually for this great discussion we're going to have.
Good. Yes. Let me start with the subtitle then. What about time travel? What do you mean with that?
I think with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that it really was a little bit of a time traveling that when we look back, let's go back 1 year in time, at this time last year. And then we can remember what was said. We will lose 25-30% of our GDP. You can probably remember these dramatic predictions. Nothing of that happened. However, the stock market started to soar. And if we look at the New York Stock Exchange, 6 companies, the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and then we throw in Microsoft there at the end. 6 companies are now 1/3 of the New York Stock Exchange, an explosion in terms of value. And there were predictions before the pandemic that was that, these companies will grow, they will be dominant, maybe even monopolies in some aspects. Well, look at them now, 1 year later. So 2020 became 2030 in many aspects. And look at what we are doing here today. These platforms, Teams and Zoom, they are not new. They were there to be used, but we didn't use them. Now we use them. What do you say, Per? Well, that initiated for you and me a little bit of a discussion and reflections on what is this?
Yeah, I actually remember very well. I think it was a year ago or maybe like just before last summer when we start talking about time machine as a way of actually making the analysis of what's happening, what is like more pandemic consequences and what will be more long lasting. And for me, that was something that was very, very much like it created a map for me also to define in which areas are we moving forward and in which areas are we actually moving backwards. So it's very interesting to see also in terms of like the view that we are as individuals, we are very habit oriented. When we are used to new habits, we stick to them. And of course, the longer the restrictions of the pandemic is here, the stronger our new habits will be. So this is actually a book about the new habits and the consequences of them for society and business and everything. So it's I think that the idea of time machine is really a good way of analyzing our time.
There is something here. The Swedish authorities published the numbers on flying here in Sweden. And we are back to 1979 in terms of passengers, which is amazing. I think of that. That's 3 years.
And that's interesting because every day we get the results if we are right or wrong in this book. What we can see actually is that among the big corporations, they are actually cutting very, very hard in the budgets for business traveling, etc., for 2022, etc. So I think that will be a very, very distinct consequence, less international business traveling.
Mm-hmm. We have actually another guest with us today. We have Paul Rapacioli, originally from London, but moved to Sweden almost 20 years ago. And you are the founder of The Local, the largest English language news network in Europe with 5 million readers every month, and also the author of this book, Good Sweden, Bad Sweden, on the psychology of news, the mechanism of twisted facts and viral content. And you were one of the first readers of this edition and helped us in that process. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the book and your questions, really. So let me give the word to you and see what you have to say about this.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you. I mean, the book is obviously extremely timely, to use that word again, and relevant. I think the consequences, what struck me from the book is that the consequences of this year are going to be felt and are being felt in so many walks of life, from how we do our shopping to where we spend our time to how we experience entertainment. But as you mentioned, Kjell, with using Teams and using Zoom, people were talking about the pace of change even before this. This is not new. We were all talking about how fast the world is changing, but oh my God, we had no idea. And I think that is what comes across in this book. It's a short book, but you've covered a lot in it. So let's try to cover at least some of the themes. And one of the key themes in the book is the dramatic structural changes taking place in cities, which has been another area of interest for both of you. And you mentioned London and Paris in particular, but I think your point is that all cities all across the world are being transformed before our eyes. Now, to some extent, that sounds very exciting. You talk about artisan works, artisan stuff happening in the center of cities, and that feels very thrilling. To think of that, but of course, there are going to be winners and losers, right? Because it's happening so fast that this creates a massive dilemma for politicians. So, how should politicians react to this now? I mean, should they try to slow down the change and protect the status quo, or should they just accept it, go with the flow, and try to build for the new future without really understanding what that future is going to be?
Yeah, I think actually what you see today is that. Of course, politicians are very different, but in cities, especially larger cities, with a very clear system where you have mayors that has a very strong position, I think what you see is actually that they see this as a momentum for change. And I think the idea of the 15-minute city, which is driven it's a focus in a lot of cities, but especially I would say Paris. But the idea is actually to decentralize the city, not focus so much on mobility, to focus more on access, to actually build cities as a network of quarters or blocks rather than functionally oriented. So what I see in a lot of these cities is that they're using the momentum. It's a quite dramatic shift in how we develop cities. I think what you see in a country like Sweden is that we also see big growth in cities with around 100,000 inhabitants, because they are to some extent already a 50-minute city. Because a 50-minute city is actually a very easy idea, is that wherever you are, you should be able to do your day-to-day life within 50 minutes by walk or bike. And of course, transforming London, transforming Paris, transforming Ottawa, whatever, it's a big thing. But we also see, and we are writing that in the book, we see the values of nature, of flexibility is growing. We also are widening the labor market with remote work. So a lot of different things are happening, which also change and develop the city. So I think there's a huge focus on decentralizing, and that also, so a city in the future may be a couple of hundred or whatever villages, rather than the idea with the city center and function based. And I think that we also have the C40, the network of progressive cities. They have actually defined 50-minute city as a role model post-corona in a sustainability perspective.
But for 200 years or more, I mean, 300, 400, 500 years, the cities that we live in today, or many of them, particularly London and Paris and the older European cities, they've been built around this idea of, or they've kind of grown up around, almost organically, I suppose, around this idea of a city centre, and the infrastructure is designed for that. These things, these big projects we're talking about to sort of reprogram that infrastructure. Two questions, I guess. One is, where do you even start with that kind of thing? Do you start building on the outskirts and just hope that things gravitate to those new centres, or do you, or what? And then the second thing is, what does that mean for today's city centres? Does that mean they become sort of dystopian wastelands?
Detroit, kind of.
Well, indeed.
Detroit is the case in point. Now, I think of a parallel first. And the parallel is to my research object, the multinational company, and I have followed them for so many years now, how they are forced every now and then, the multinational companies, to reinvent themselves, because they are subject to so many forces that otherwise would destroy them. Bureaucracy would be one such thing. When you are approaching 300,000 employees in 130 countries, bureaucracy becomes an issue. Demotivated staff. People feel that they are just part of, I don't know, an anonymous kind of organization. You don't know your boss personally. So these companies reinvented themselves beginning basically 20, 25 years ago, and did that oxymoronic thing, being big and small at the same time. Because you want the power of the big company, but you also want the dynamism of the small company. And this is, I think, cities are now coming more or less into the same sort of dilemma. How can we be big and small at the same time? And this is the thing, the liberator, the driving force that enables us, again, the word enable here is critical, enable us to do things like this, what we're doing today, internet shopping, all the possibilities that technology now offers us, make us believe, at least Per and me, that the 15-minute city is within reach. It's not just a theory. We can do it now. Nacka Sjöstad here in Stockholm would be a 15-minute city, I guess. What would you say, Per?
Yeah, and I think you should also add to this what we also saw very clear before the pandemic, that the privately owned car is challenged. And for example, in a city like Stockholm, we use 51% of all land is actually used for the car. For roads, parking spots, etc. And that is a very important part of the development of the 50-minute city, because you can then create like places for young people, places for elderly. I think also that you mentioned artisan, that is one of our conclusions, but I also think that we're going to develop a lot of new places for work, because I think that the transformation of how we work will end up that we will work in 4 different rooms: the traditional office, our homes, the third room, co-working, cafes, public spaces, and the digital room. And I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in how we can actually use space, develop cities to fit, to be a place for work, because we also see a convergence between work and free time and leisure. So actually, it's very, very classical that we are actually have to create cities for people. And I think that a very clear consequence right now is that I think all cities I have been in contact with, they are working in project between politics, real estate owners, retail, restaurants, to redefine city center. And to redefine city center in a time where new space occurs. So there's a lot of things connecting together. And what I see is that also in small cities, the idea of flexibility is actually dramatically growing. And of course, it will depend to a large extent, I think, in how much are we going to work remote. Because that makes us more independent of geography and makes it more possible for us to use the city in a new way.
I have the feeling, Paul, that the attraction of the inner parts of the city was almost given during the post-war era, you know, with shopping being there, the exclusive, any kind of exclusive brand you found there. And it kept up the attraction of the city center. But now, given that many of the outlets are closing, as we know, we could end up not in a Detroit situation, but with a city center that is not as attractive for you and me as a place to live. You know,
I think that what we will see, and that is what I see happens in a lot of city centers now, is that they are planning for more housing. So the city center is transforming itself into a community with a distinct idea. And we will rather have cities with like decentralized, where the city center is going to be more like a normal block or community or what we call it. So, and that is, I believe that in some, like Gothenburg, for example, they have 2% living in the city center. So they are really challenges. Stockholm is 12%. So it also defined a little bit how it is. I think the having all bureaucracy, as we, for example, have in Stockholm, is not a good thing automatically. I think it's better to be Barcelona than Madrid or be Milan than Rome, for example.
In terms of attraction.
Yeah, attraction, creativity, because having these thousands of like governmental bodies is not so very sexy anymore. It isn't.
Maybe it never was.
It doesn't sound too bad at all. I mean, it sounds like these, you know, these cities that are kind of buzzing in the morning, dead for a few hours, buzzing at lunchtime, dead for a few hours, then completely empty at night. It sounds like that's perhaps on the way out, and we're looking at a more human.
Absolutely. But I think we have to add as well, because this is we have a very positive note here, but what we also see as a consequence, of course, increasing polarization, increasing difference between increasingly higher threshold to come into the labor market, etc., etc. So of course, this happens at the same time. So I think that will be one thing is a 50-minute city, but the other thing is actually how could you have inclusive cities? And of course,
can you?
What?
And how can you?
Yeah, I mean, how can we? That I think that is the big X factor in looking forward for the Western European countries, because we're pushing back normal, pushing back middle class, and we're transforming the labor market. The knowledge that is actually attractive is changing. So we have also been looking into quite a lot what happened with authorities, the transformation of power. So it's a decentralizing, but it's also, I would say, a transformation of power and responsibility from societal perspective to the individual, also with the gig economy and everything. So there is also challenges arising in these new cities.
I think one of the things that defines these cities, certainly in Europe, is how international they are, how increasingly international they are. I mean, I've seen a huge change just in Stockholm in the last 10, 15 years. You walk down the street, you're almost as likely to hear English or Spanish or French being spoken as you are Swedish. So with more people living these extremely international lives, perhaps people living in a country that's not where we grew up, with partners from a different country, hybrid children, and so on. I mean, there are all sorts of benefits to this. I mean, perhaps understated cultural benefits, commercial benefits, diplomatic. But these journeys haven't started for over a year. People haven't been moving for over a year. And in one of two of your scenarios in the book, they may not move in the same way anymore. Does this worry you, this lack of international fluidity?
Interesting. In a way, theoretically, yes. In practice, not. Theoretically, it's a worry because much of the wealth that we have created over the course of at least the last 30, 40 years is due to increased work specialization. The world has become so much bigger in 40 years, with China joining the world economy, 1.4 billion people, India, of course, almost 1.4, the former Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. And this drove a lot of growth. And that was due to internationalization, cross-border investments, and what have you. Now, imagine that this now all of a sudden comes to a halt. Then at least a certain percentage of that growth will go up in smoke, basically. It won't be there. So in that sense, it's worrisome when I look at the fact that we don't interact to the same degree. However, looking at what we're doing right now, it seems like our economies, companies, and lives are indeed much more robust than what we ever thought they were. Look at Sweden now. Less than 3% of GDP we lost 2020. Unbelievable. And that tells me that we were able to shift from one way of doing things into another way of doing things very rapidly due to technology. Robustness is the word for it, I guess, in English.
Yeah, and I think if you're just going to add there, I think that we also wrote the book Urban Express, also published in English at Volante in, I think it was 2014. And one thing we underestimated at that time, I would say, was the growing political nationalism. And I think that will also be a consequence. I think that how people will perceive that politics and authorities are managing vaccination, etc., will affect very much how politics will develop, because it could be also a possibility for actually more science-based politics, etc. But the other thing I think, and that is a challenge for a lot of us in these times, both what you had in your question, but also the general trends of increasing political nationalism, is that because I believe there's a very clear correlation between diversity and creativity. And for a country like Sweden, the Northern Europe, quite open, very export-oriented countries, it will be very important, I believe, that we are actually coming back as soon as possible to this more positive agenda towards diversity. Because I agree the economies are robust, the companies are robust, but I think that we have a movement in politics that could be dangerous, I think, for long-term economic growth.
I mean, you talk in your book about deglobalization and the deglobalizing process. And to sort of stay on the theme of nationalism, economic nationalism, if we're deglobalizing, that means that, okay, we can still talk on Zoom and so on, but we're going to have less personal experiences of different places. We're going to be traveling less, we're going to be meeting people face to face and experiencing different cultures to a lesser extent. Does that create a vacuum for that could be filled by disinformation about different countries and create a sort of space for misunderstanding, which is essentially the fuel for polarization and nationalism?
I think the short answer to that is yes. Wherever there is such a vacuum created for some reason, it will be filled with speculations, dreams, vague ideas, and what have you, trolls. Having said that, I think the deglobalization, or whatever we should call it, started before the pandemic. That's number one. There were tendencies towards that before any virus hit our respective countries. So that's number one. Number two, which we have been discussing, Per and I, over the course of the last year, how global were we really? Sweden is supposed to be one of the most open economies in the world and globalized in that sense. And then you look at the top 10 trading partners of the Kingdom of Sweden. And you can quickly see that the other Nordic countries is about 25% of the exports and the imports. And then you throw in Germany, the UK, Netherlands, and the other usual suspects. And you have 70–80% of the kingdom's exports and imports. Basically the same countries that we traded with 500 years ago. And so, I mean, maybe globalization, it was a term coined by Michael Porter at Harvard Business School 1986 in an article. Maybe that was a pie in the sky, a pipe dream. But it was an ambition. But we never were global. We were regional at a maximum, I would argue. Even one of the world's most open economies, namely Sweden. I find it really fascinating when you dig into the numbers. What do you say, Per? This is you and me have been spending hours on this.
A lot of this. So that is one aspect. And I think the other is what is happening, though, is that the idea of global companies with a global, very complex supply chain, this is challenged because, but that is also because of automation. It's cheap. You don't have to use so much labor to produce things anymore. So you could actually move production closer to your market to be more faster, more adaptable. And time and pace of speed seems to be more important. But what we also see in terms of globalization is one, globalization of information and ideas, that's growing. Second, which is interesting in terms of increasing remote working, that it's of course very nice to have this romantic idea that you can live in the small village of Norway, Denmark, Holland, and connect yourself to the labor market in the big city and maybe keep the big city salary. But we will also see that in what will happen is we will also see a globalization of workforce, because you can also see it in Hanoi or Kiev or Warsaw. So globalization are changing, but the idea of being heavily global, that's more an idea we had about ourselves than we actually saw in reality. So maybe we will just keep to what we have done.
One possibility, I'm not saying that this is the case, but one possibility to summarize this is to say the soft stuff is going global, but the hard stuff is going regional. We can still share our music, ideas, and what have you, the soft stuff. And we will, I guess we will, to a large extent, do that. But the hard stuff, the things that you can drop on your toe, so to speak, we will increasingly manufacture locally or regionally for a number of reasons. Technology is the usual suspect.
Yeah, but we have also actually speculated, I would say, about maybe a development where the world is like falling down in maybe 2-3 civilizations.
Yes.
With maybe Western Europe, US as one, China, Asia, and maybe Russia as another. So maybe we will see also a very clear political regionalization as well.
Yes. We have, in practical terms, Paul, I would argue, internet is not a monolithic structure anymore. Gradually, we have a Chinese-led kind of internet where you and I and many of us, we are not there. We don't know how it works. We are not on that platform, if it's a platform. We are on the Western one.
So essentially, you're talking about being global in mind, but local in body.
Yes.
To some extent, which I think is encouraging to many extent. If you think about how, and you've talked about this, how local communities have been drained of talent that has flooded to the cities. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in is how there's been a massive collapse in local news across Europe and across the United States in the last decade or so, which has had a tremendously negative effect on local communities, has increased polarization. What we've seen though in the pandemic is that people have been very much focused on what's going on in their own backyard. They wanted to know about the local news about the virus, the restrictions and vaccine rollouts that affect them most. It started to make people look more locally, look around us. Do you think it's too idealist to think that a lasting effect might be more focus on local communities, people realizing that those networks and ties, the glue that binds our communities together is more important, local news is more important? Could that be an effect from this?
What we see is, for one hand, the consumption of more linear news, especially public service, has actually not decreased in the level that a lot of us expected. And for just to add to the more local news orientation, we see that also the big formats in public service actually are heading up very, very well, with like 1.5 million viewers for the big formats, etc. So there is maybe something interesting happening. I think from a more Swedish perspective, of course, it's a very, I would say, broad majority in the politics also for keeping quality in the more local news. But I'm not very sure that the traditional local publishing houses will be the publishing houses. But I think the interest for what's happening in your backyard, local, is increasing heavily. And it also connects with what are values that are more important, but also with the artisan, everything that, and I've seen a lot of like research about what do people want to see in the city or in the community. And it's very, very clear. They want to see local, unique things, shops, everything, and they don't like the big chains. So I believe that if that will lead that we will consume more local news, I think that's a question mark for me.
We talked a lot of the stuff that we talked about has been macro. It'd be quite interesting to finish on a more micro aspect of this and how individuals should behave. I mean, there have been so many restrictions, so much rapid change in people's lives, so much uncertainty. And I think you've explained and argued that on a macro level, that uncertainty has not been a growth killer. If anything, it's probably going to lead to increased growth. But obviously that's going to shift from individuals. Certain individuals are going to lose out, certain individuals are going to win. Have we learned anything from this period of uncertainty on a personal level about how to handle uncertainty itself and how we should react in these, how we should handle these times of change from a personal perspective?
What a great question. You or me, Per?
You can start. You're a good psychologist here.
Uncertainty reduction.
Top tip. That's all we need.
But generally speaking, uncertainty is one of these things that we human beings don't like. We try to avoid it at all times. And the healthy Homo sapiens try to avoid uncertainty. If there are two options, you choose the less uncertain one. You do, me do. On average, we do that, all of us. Here, of course, we went into sort of, I don't know what we should call it, this maximum uncertainty for some time. My feeling, I don't know whether you share that feeling, was that the world was standing still there for a week or two when this started. All the planes on the ground, the streets were empty, and there were government representatives, you know, presenting figures on how many planes that were grounded today, how many people that were dead. I thought it was quite dramatic, the standstill. I think what this has shown us is the power of sharing knowledge, the soft stuff. The fact that we were able to fight back with 30 vaccines in less than 1 year, unbelievable. And reduced uncertainty for all of us, I guess. The fact that we could see that we have now 30, at least they call it candidates, you remember from the beginning, 30 candidates. Now we have maybe 6 vaccines or something like that, and more to come. I think we have learned that we can do it, as Barack Obama said. We can do it, but there has to be a little bit of pressure. Otherwise, we don't do it. Lazy as we are, all of us.
But can I also add, I also think that because we have the last year spoken a lot what we call liquid fear,
yes.
The movement from predictable fear, when we know what our fears are, we know the challenges, we can educate us for planning, and we feel that we know what's going to happen. And we also know what is a recipe for success. Now we're living more and more in a world with liquid fear. We will be less and less surprised whatever will happen. And the way of handling uncertainty is actually to be prepared for uncertainty. And I believe, I have 2 daughters, 15 and 17 years old. I think they are extremely prepared, and they will be not very surprised when the next big thing will happen. So in this sense, this is also a time machine in terms of movement towards liquid fear, liquid love and liquid fear. But I think that it changes the perception of being a citizen and a human being, waking up and we're uncertain. It's like going back in some sense to the agricultural society where you woke up and don't know if you have something to eat today. The food we have fixed, but there are other things that we are actually more essential for us as well.
I think 60 years of growth, stability, controlled currencies and financial markets, that was the 70s, 80s and 90s, created an artificial feeling of certainty that we gradually come out of that bubble, Paul, I think, and are confronted with the fact that the world never was a very certain place. It was an illusion.
But also a world of structure with labor market, defined labor times, functional oriented cities. Everything was very clear how to be a human being, how to live your life, how to be successful. With this fragmentization, hits everything. So it's a decentralization in almost everything, and the centers are losing power.
And do you think this sort of bubbles its way up to the top in terms of decision making, up to the top of governments in terms of this kind of liquid fear? So will approaches to disaster preparedness change now, do you think?
I could say that I was in politics on a more central level in Sweden between 2003 and 13 for 10 years. And I noticed that very clear. In the beginning, we believed we could predict quite well the consequences of reforms. We do this and the output will be like 50,000 new jobs. In the end of this period, we didn't have any idea because it was more and more difficult. The second thing we saw was that in terms of a voter behavior, the personalizing of politics is more important because I'm voting for someone not only because I think the politics or the policies are right, because this is somebody I could trust when uncertainty hits us. That was very clear, for example, with the Swedish Minister of Finance, Anders Borg. He was very credible, and a lot of people who maybe didn't like his policy voted for him because of this, you feel secure in an unsecure world. So I would believe that. I also think that we see in local governments, in national governments, we are preparing now for the next pandemic. So we will have a lot of we will be prepared for this. And of course, the next crisis will be something else.
Right, Tobias, do we have time for more questions?
I think we, if you have one last question, we can add that one last. So anything that you want to add, otherwise we are getting close to this discussion.
Okay, I'd like to ask one more question then, that I think has been a challenge for organisations in this scenario, which seems inevitable, where people are more distributed, working from home, travelling less. I'm talking about larger organisations now, but even small organisations. How does leadership change in that scenario? How do you motivate your staff? How do you get them sort of fired up and all pulling in the same direction when everybody's all over the place and have got their washing on in the background and kids coming home and so on?
Yeah, we have actually looked quite a lot into this, how this transforms leadership. And somebody calls it remote leadership, distance leadership. And I think the preliminary result is actually that the leadership has to be more more based on showing and telling and visualizing for people where we are heading, so that everybody doing their thing in their organization can feel how that fits into what other people are doing. So the leadership has to be more visionary and more engaging. On the other hand, it also has to be more structure, because everybody is distributed around the world. Maybe you have to have a very, very good structure in how to work when everything fits together. So it's a really dramatic shift towards more communication, more visionary leadership, but more structure. And interesting to see in the research that has been done, it's not very much, but it's very clear that women feel much more comfortable with this type of leadership than men do. Because, of course, this is challenging the power of the physical room. So it's interesting to see also how that actually affects power.
So could that be another time machine effect, that we see a sudden surge in female leadership?
Yeah, yes. I believe so, yeah. Because it's also you have to be much more empathic to actually how people, how they are like feeling, what's the day-to-day life, if you can't have them in the same room. Also the structure of power for us men, when we have dominated the boardrooms and the leadership, it's very easy. Now everything is more distributed. It's much more difficult to have the tools of power that we have had. New tools are actually developing, I believe. I don't know what you, Kjell, what do you say?
I'm thinking of Hells Angels and Ho Chi Minh.
As always.
No, I'm thinking of organizations where people for long periods of time don't meet, but they still hold the organization together, and they are under pressure. Just like a company in a way, you are under pressure. People are in various countries. They are nowadays at home too. They don't meet very frequently, and still you are able to hold the thing together. And values is, of course, the name of the game. And companies had, before the pandemic, started to hire people a little bit for attitude rather than their skills. That had started, and it was discussed in several industries. Let's go for attitude. Skills we can fix. They are available. Skills are actually in the market. You can buy skills even today. You can buy the software, you can buy a trainer, what have you. And now I think we have speeded up, time machine again, that process towards hiring people for what kind of values, attitudes they have. And that enables us to hold things together if we share something. Because then you have to share something that you believe in, or a way of acting on information, or what have you. Ho Chi Minh or Hells Angels, they have shown that it's possible.
Thank you, Paul. One last question to Kjell and Per. You have both traveled around the world for decades. I mean,
yes.
I mean, here at SpeakersNet, we have had clients in over 100 countries, and your traveling is one of the big reasons for that. When do you think it will open up again? When will you be out there on the stages again? Will that ever happen?
It will happen to some degree, but we have been joking about the fact that we human beings are like a big lazy ape. Lazy we are. That means that once we have establish a habit, they die rather hard because we don't want to change. And now many of our clients out there in the world are used to the fact that you can do a lot with new technology like this. 50% at the maximum will come back in. It will take at least one more year because we are out there before we are out there, but not 100%. We will come back. More like 50. What do you say, Per?
If it's 50 or not, I don't know, but I'm very sure that I think we see actually that new logic is appearing where everything that is like function based, we will try to do more digital. And the thing that is more experience based and culture based, etc., I try to do physical. And I think also looking into like how companies are working, this will be more and more defining. So I think that we will come back, but not to this large like way we had. But I think that we will when we are actually gathering a lot of people from around the world, we will focus a very lot of quality. So I think we will see a raise in quality, but it will take a long time. And I think that we will do a lot of like hybrid things where we are doing both the digital room, but also the physical room. And of course, there's a lot of effectiveness, productivity gain you can do out of this. It will come, but it will not come in the same pace, I think. And it will be much more also in connection with digital relations, I think.
Thank you both. And for all of you that have listened to us, don't miss this book, Corona Express. And if you have any questions, follow us or send us an email at info@volante.se, or for speaking inquiries, info@speakersnet.se. So thank you, and have you all a really good day.